What if you had the opportunity to switch your brain off every time you went to work? What if there could be some sort of separation between your memories from work and your memories from your personal life, making it so that when you leave work, it doesn't feel like you were even there in the first place? These are the questions that the TV show Severance tries to answer. For those who have not seen the show, here is a summary of its premise. The characters undergo a procedure called severance, in which a small chip is implanted into their brain. This chip makes it so that whenever they go to work, they completely forget who they are outside of work and are unable to remember anything about their personal lives. Likewise, when they leave work, they go back to being their outside selves and forget everything they did at their workplace, which in this show is a mysterious company called Lumen. Now, in theory, this doesn't seem like such a bad idea. I mean, if you have no memory of ever being at work, then it's almost like you're never even working yourself, but instead letting this different version of you, this different person, do all the hard work for you. As far as your outside self is concerned, you literally aren't doing anything, and yet you're getting paid for it. However, that is also precisely the reason why, on an ethical level, this procedure is super problematic. If to your outside self it might seem like you're never working, then the opposite is true for your work self. To them, it feels like they're always at work. Also, since they don't remember who they are outside of work, they are effectively entirely different people from their outside selves. Who these people are is completely based on their own experiences from work and not on any of the experiences that their outside self might have had. Therefore, the work selves, or innies, are people who are separate from their outside selves, or outies, and who exist in their own right. So basically, by undergoing the severance procedure, you're imprisoning an innocent human being who simply does not deserve that. Now that we're clear on what this procedure entails, in this video I want to focus on the actual work that the innies do. Seemingly, their job is to put numbers into categories based on the emotions that these numbers induce. But how can numbers even elicit emotions? Are the numbers real, or are they supposed to represent something else entirely? I'll be answering this from a neuroscientific perspective, and I'll be using this perspective to explain the main theory I was able to come up with regarding these mysterious numbers. However, I must warn you that there will be spoilers beyond this point. If you have not seen Severance, I highly suggest you go watch it before coming back to this video. In my opinion, the show is truly a masterpiece and for that reason alone deserves to be seen in its entirety. Spoilers will not go beyond episode 3 of season 2 because as I am making this video, the 4th episode has yet to come out. With that being said, let us now tackle the neuroscience behind Severance. First of all, I'd like to quickly go over some of the existing theories regarding the work that is being done at Lumen. Some people have claimed that basically the numbers represent nothing since the characters aren't actually working at all, but are instead part of an experiment that is being conducted by Lumen. Maybe Lumen just wants to observe how severed people act and how different people might respond in different ways to this procedure. Although this is a solid hypothesis, since Severance does openly criticize the way capitalism forces people to accomplish a lot of meaningless tasks, the Lexington letters would suggest otherwise. Essentially, the Lexington letters are a set of fictional letters that were released by Severance creators. In these letters, it is implied that 2 minutes after a severed employee finished one of their files, a truck that belonged to one of Lumen's competitors got blown up. So here is what we can conclude with the evidence that we have so far. The numbers do represent something, and at least some of them have real-life consequences. Another theory that I came across was that the numbers aren't actually numbers at all. Something else is being displayed on the character's screen, but the characters only see it as numbers because the chip that is in their brain has the ability to transform their vision that way. Now, the only reason why Lumen would do this, in my opinion, is because they want the work to be extra confidential, and hiding the material basically makes it that much more secret. Even though the Audis can't even remember their job to begin with, concealing the info does add another layer of safety. However, I don't think that this is the case since Milchik isn't severed. Since he doesn't have a chip in his brain, according to this theory, he would be able to see what was actually on the character's screen. Not only that, but he would also be able to remember the info when he leaves work, which would not make the work very confidential anymore. This is why this hypothesis doesn't make much sense, in my opinion. Therefore, we now know something else about the numbers, which is that they are actual numbers when the characters are looking at them. I know that this statement might sound kind of stupid right now, but please bear with me. I have my own theory about the innie's job that is pretty consistent with everything we've learned so far. First of all, we need to take a look at the kinds of memories that the innies have access to. Generally speaking, memory can be separated into two categories: short-term memory and long-term memory. I'm sure you're all familiar with these concepts. Short-term memory allows us to remember things that happened a few moments ago and to only remember them for a short period of time. On the other hand, long-term memory means remembering events that happened both recently and a long time ago, and being able to remember these events for long periods of time. Now, the innie's short-term memory is clearly intact. For example, in the very first scene, Helly was able to answer Mark's questions right after he asked them. If her short-term memory had been impaired, she would have forgotten the questions immediately after they had been asked. However, I don't think that looking at short-term memory will help us figure out what the numbers mean. The innies always associate the numbers with certain emotions. It's not some temporary thing that they sometimes learn and then forget about. Therefore, I think it would be best to focus on the character's long-term memory for this video. Do the innies have access to any long-term memories? At first glance, it doesn't really seem that way since they don't remember anything about who they are on the outside. But what if there were different types of long-term memory? A patient who contributed greatly to our understanding of long-term memory is patient HM. In the 20th century, patient HM unfortunately had to get some parts of his brain surgically removed as an attempt to cure his epilepsy. As a result, his long-term memory was seriously impaired. He was unable to remember events that happened in the years leading up to his surgery and was unable to create new long-lasting memories. So it seems like this guy had absolutely no long-term memory left, right? Well, researchers came up with the idea of asking him to draw a figure by looking only at its reflection in a mirror, and they would ask him to do this multiple times a day. They found that with each attempt, he would get better and better at this task, even though he had no memory of any of his previous attempts. This shows that he did have some form of long-term memory, more specifically a type of memory that was subconscious, since it did not require him to consciously remember previous events. This makes it easier to understand why long-term memory was then broken down into two categories: explicit memory, which requires you to use your conscience in order to intentionally remember things, and implicit memory, which allows you to remember things without having to consciously think about them. I highly recommend checking out this video if you want to know more about the types of explicit memory that the innies still have access to, since this video explains it really well, in my opinion. For the purposes of this video, though, I'll only mention this. The innies basically have no explicit memory, except for some semantic memories that they're still able to remember. They don't remember things that most of us would consciously remember about ourselves, such as their names, where they live, and basically anything about who they were before being severed. However, they do still have their Audi's subconscious memories. For example, Mark knows how to make coffee. They all know how to use a computer, how to write, and some of them even know how to draw. These are subconscious because they are skills or actions that the characters have repeated many times over the course of their lives. When you practice a skill that many times, it becomes automatic to you, or a subconscious memory. This type of implicit memory that is related to skills is called procedural memory. It's because of his intact procedural memory that patient HM was able to learn a new skill. Likewise, we can say that the innies' procedural memory is intact because they can perform the same basic skills that their outies can perform. So, since the innies have almost no explicit memory, I think that focusing on their implicit memory is going to make much more sense if we want to figure out how the numbers are able to induce emotions. So far, we've talked about procedural memory, which is just one type of implicit memory. There are many other types, and the one I want to focus on today is called classical conditioning. Instead of giving you a long and boring definition of what classical conditioning is, here is a famous example that you've probably already heard of. Pavlov was a physiologist who noticed that his dogs would salivate when food was presented to them. Makes sense, right? Well, he also noticed that if he rang a bell before feeding his dogs every day, at some point the dogs would start to salivate at the sound of the bell alone, even if the food hadn't been presented to them yet. So basically, here is what he concluded from this experiment. An unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that induces an automatic response. Here, the food is an unconditioned stimulus because it makes the dog salivate, and salivating is an automatic behavior for a dog that sees food. The bell is a neutral stimulus because it doesn't normally induce any sort of automatic response in dogs. However, if we associate this neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus over and over again, then one day the neutral stimulus alone will be enough to produce the automatic behavior. This is why, after a while, the bell was able to make the dogs salivate all on its own. Now, you might be thinking, what does any of this have to do with severance? Well, here's the theory that I've come up with. I believe that the innies in Severance were conditioned to associate sequences of numbers with certain emotions. In order to illustrate this, let's take a look at the numbers that the innies seem to find scary. In this case, the unconditioned stimulus might have been a violent picture, or at least some sort of creepy picture which produces fear as an automatic response. Then the innies would have been shown these scary pictures alongside neutral stimuli, which in this case would be certain sequences of numbers. After being repeatedly shown the pictures and the numbers side by side, they would eventually learn to associate the sequences of numbers that they saw with fear. This could work with any other emotion as well. Also, I used pictures as an example, but the unconditioned stimulus could be literally anything that produces fear. A sound, a video, etc. So maybe it wasn't just a generic scary picture, but something much more specific that is actually linked to what Lumen is trying to achieve. This hypothesis does raise a few questions though. I mean, when could the innies have undergone this classical conditioning? I believe that maybe sometimes when we see them leaving work, they aren't actually leaving work at all, but are being severed again and then going somewhere else in Lumen where they have to go through this classical conditioning. According to this theory, there would be two different innies, one who works at MDR and one who goes through classical conditioning. Having a third innie whose existence is completely unknown to its outie and to its other innie would make the information that this innie learns through conditioning extra confidential. The innies who work at MDR might think that they're leaving work at, say, 5:15, but who says that this clock is even accurate to begin with? Since the innies are stuck on the severed floor all day, how do we know that their sense of time isn't being manipulated? What if they're actually leaving an hour earlier than we think in order to undergo this conditioning process? This is also consistent with what we talked about earlier. In this scenario, the numbers represent the emotions that they were associated with during conditioning. This theory is compatible with our second claim as well, although we still don't know what those real-life consequences could be other than making things explode. Lastly, the numbers are actual numbers when the characters are looking at them, because the innies learned what emotions to associate with them during conditioning. The innies don't need to be shown anything other than the numbers in order to complete their job. On that note, I'll let you guys tell me in the comments below if this theory seems at all plausible to you. In any case, thank you guys so much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.